Good morning, St. Luke's. Welcome to our daily Bible readings. We're looking at our last psalm of this week, Psalm number 10. So, as with before, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, why don't you pause and have a read through now? There are 18 verses for you to read through quickly, and then we can go through them together. Over the last few days, we've seen how David, the writer of these psalms, how his emotions have moved. His tone has changed from praise and hope in the God of justice to this morning where we see him asking the ultimate question that proceeds from the hope and faith that David has in God's justice. Verse 1 of Psalm 10 asks this ultimate question: "Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Whilst David gave thanks yesterday for how he knew God had acted in justice through the course of David's experience and expressed a hope in God's ultimate justice as the sovereign ruler of the nations, we know actually many occasions when we look at our own lives or at the world around us, we see that the wicked are prospering at the expense of the righteous, and it poses a question to us. Why does it seem that God is standing far off? Why does he seem to be hiding in times of trouble? It's important to note that David addresses this question to God himself. So there is a recognition in David's prayer in this psalm, both of the presence of God, the existence of God, and also the character of God, that he is a God who cares about justice. If David didn't know God to be that, he wouldn't ask the question of him. So what do we see in the course of this psalm? Well, firstly, in verses 2 through to 11, we see a character profile of the wicked person. So variously in verse 2, they're described as arrogant and those that exploit the weak. In verse 3, as boastful and greedy. Verses 7 to 8, they are full of deceit. And then also at the end of verse 4, they are set against God. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. And the conclusion at the end in verse 11, he says to himself, God has forgotten, he covers his face and never sees. The wicked person thinks that God is absent and so can get away with whatever he or she wants. What's particularly challenging, though, for us is in the middle, in the picture of the character profile of the wicked person, is that often we see that they prosper. His ways are always prosperous. He is haughty and your laws are far from him. He sneers at all his enemies. And then in verse 6, he says to himself, nothing will shake me. I'll always be happy and never have trouble. These things are difficult to stomach because that the wicked person does well and appears to be self-confident and determined are often things that actually we hold in high regard. There are points where we will have been on the receiving end of the prosperity of the wicked person. We will have been the weak person who's been exploited. Equally, though, we need to be honest and know that there are times when we will have been the wicked person to others, exploiting the weak, being arrogant and deceitful. The psalmist, though, knows that God is aware of wickedness. In verse 14, but you, O God, you do see trouble and grief. You consider it and you take it to hand. It's important to know this, that when we are afflicted, God does see the grief and the hardship that we go through, but also know it when we might be those that are afflicting others. David is confident in verse 15. The victim commits himself to you, to God. You are the helper of the fatherless, and so break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Call him to account for his wickedness that would not otherwise be found out. If we are listening to this morning, maybe as part of our church family at St. Luke's or somebody else who has stumbled across this, know that if we are guilty of afflicting the weak and the vulnerable, if we are the wicked person who prospers at the expense of others, God sees, God knows what we are doing, and he is aware of it. Let's take the chance this morning to change our ways. God's heart is set towards the weak, so we must not be slow to cry out to him when we feel afflicted or for the affliction of others. But how can we account for the apparent inaction of God? Well, we saw at the beginning of the week that the Psalms are a mirror to our souls, but they are also deeply rich in pointing us to Jesus. Wickedness is as much a diagnosis of ourselves. In fact, the Apostle Paul uses a quote from Psalm 10 when he is making this comment about humanity, that no one is righteous and all of us fall short of the glory of God. And then we look to Jesus. Jesus is the one who would be numbered amongst the wicked. Jesus is the one where we see God enact his justice upon himself. He pours out his anger and his judgment on his own Son, who willingly takes it in order that we might be spared God's judgment for our wickedness. Then Jesus' resurrection points us to God's ultimate victory over wickedness and evil, and also promises through Jesus' resurrection that he will one day return and God's just judgment will be enacted against even those wicked who have prospered in arrogance. So let us be those that continue to cry out to God for his justice in our world, but do so secure in knowing that our own wickedness will be spared God's judgment because it has fallen upon Jesus. And then also know that those who flout God's rules and laws now will not escape eternally, but instead rest secure in the words of the psalmist in verse 16, "The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from this land. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, in order that man who is of the earth may terrify no more." May there be glory to this God, our God. Amen.